Today we're going to talk about a very simple principle, piece of advice given to us in Proverbs. This isn't one of those topics where I could say this is the most important thing in your Christian life ever. I do sometimes, I'm not critical of this, but it is curious sometimes where preachers will get up and say, this is the most important topic, and then you hear them preach a couple weeks later on a different topic. This is the most important topic, and a little bit later, this is the most important topic. This is not one of those at all, but I do think it's some advice, some wisdom from Proverbs here. At least it helps me. Hopefully it'll help you a little bit with not making, well, the verse says there brings folly and shame if we fail to heed the advice given to us. And that's not something I want to have in my life. So verse 13 of Proverbs 18, we see our verse there. He that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is folly and shame unto him. Pretty simple thought. And as I've thought through my life over a while now, and then for this sermon, there's lots of places we can apply this, and lots of places that we can bring folly and shame into our life if we're not careful, if we answer a matter before we hear it. So let's pray, and we can look at this. Lord, we ask that you'd help us as we look in your word, that we would take what it says and apply it. Lord, there's wisdom given to us here. We can avoid pain in our own life. We can avoid hurting other people. Lord, there's versus folly and shame. If we make this mistake, help us to heed this warning. Again, we thank you for your word. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. All right, the most direct and I think obvious point here is that it's foolish and shameful to react to a problem or make some sort of judgment call before you know the whole story. All right? Foolish and shameful to react or make a judgment call before we know the whole story. It's very easy to do that. All right? Very easy to do that. It takes patience, takes some discretion, sometimes some humility to not react when we first hear it. I've fallen into this trap where I hear about something and just make some declarative statement about this is what happened and this is why. And then a little bit later, I realized, wow, that wasn't what happened and that wasn't why it happened. All right, I answered before I knew the situation. So it's an easy trap that we can fall into here. I thought of some very, very simple illustrations to get us going here. Probably none of you would have ever done this, but I've heard of other kids that do this. I didn't either, of course. But some kid at school loses something, and they run to the teacher. And anybody know what does the kid always say? Somebody stole my toy, right? And you know the teacher goes and looks in her desk and says, no, it's right here in your desk. No one stole it. The kid's first reaction was to assume that someone stole their toy. They answered before they heard. Right? None of us would do that, I know. Or you're playing a game of dodgeball or something like that. I'm thinking of King's Kids or Master Club games. How many times kids came up to me and said, so-and-so just pushed me. And I'm thinking, you're playing dodgeball in the gym. You know, it kind of happens, right? But you know, someone pushes me down and they come running to the teacher, whoever. Someone pushed me down. They did it on purpose. Really? They're assuming something, all right? Kids they run into each other, right? Most likely it's not on purpose. Most likely there were two people running for the ball, and the other kid that didn't come yell at the teacher, he's laying there with blood coming out of his nose, and you know his arm's broken. But the one kid who wasn't hurt, he pushed me, all right, on purpose. I saw it. He wrote me a note last night, so he was going to push me, all right. But sometimes we make that crazy assumption and jump there. Sorry, a silly example. Or for us older people that drive, how many have ever been stuck behind a slow driver? Okay. How many of you assume that, wow, they're probably coming home from their mother's funeral and they're sad and they just need a peaceful drive? How many assume that? How many assume that person got up and their only goal for the day was to irritate you on the road? That was it. I'm there. I have to fight it. Try not to look at Mr. Schrock. All right, kind of a silly example, but there we're answering before we hear it. Right? When the roles reversed, when we're the one in the fast lane going slow, and we look up and realize there's a stack of cars behind us, we don't yell at ourselves. We say, oh, well, they should understand because whatever our excuse is. It's understandable for us, but not for the other person. We answer this thing before we hear it. And those are some simple examples, but I think you can see the point there that we can get to some very wrong conclusions if we answer before we hear it. All right, one other thing here could introduce us is that we need to be very, very careful about assuming somebody's motivation in something. We can see their actions, but it's really hard to know what their motivation was. And there are times that we can tell, but that's a place that I've observed where people make assumptions about why somebody did something, and you can get to some very, very bad places there. So, high schoolers, one, if he doesn't do your homework, I could assume that you didn't do the homework because you thought it was stupid and the teacher had no right to give it. Would that be the right assumption to make? Yes, no, Ashley, that's the wrong answer. No, I would be jumping to conclusions. Now you're going to get in trouble for not doing your homework. You get a homework file, you get a 0, whatever. But to go ahead and make that crazy leap, I don't know. Now, if you write a letter to the teacher and say, this is stupid, why did you give us this homework? Then you tell us what you're thinking. You make it easier, right? But I shouldn't make that jump. Now, please don't try to decide if I've ever made that jump, high schoolers. I have at times. So, all right. I once got in trouble. I was a new boss came onto the job, and he had said he wanted to fix certain things. So I thought, all right, I'm going to fix these things. And I got called into the boss's office, and he thought I was undermining his authority, making changes without his permission. I thought, I'm trying to fix it, all right? He quickly understood his mistake. He was new, but he had jumped to this conclusion that I was trying to undermine his authority as this new boss. Like, I'm going to flex in my muscles somehow, and I'm not going to get fired for doing it. But he had jumped to some conclusions. Again, in that case, he understood very quickly. But it's easy to jump to those conclusions where someone's doing something and we don't really see it. So anyway, we have to be very, very careful about assuming motivations because we don't always know. All right. In fact, most of the time we don't know someone's true motivations. We have to be careful there. All right. A couple of warnings I have. We're going to apply this to several areas of our lives, but before we get to that application, I thought of some warnings for us as we think about this principle, this piece of wisdom, and how we apply it. So, first warning I have is that this does not mean we're not allowed to judge or evaluate situations. All right, so don't come out of here saying, well, I never know the whole story, so I can never make an evaluation. That is not the point. All right. John 17:24 says, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Right? We're supposed to make judgments and evaluations. We have to. So the point here isn't that we can't make these. The point is that we have to be careful and make sure we hear before we make the decision, before we make some sort of judgment call. Titus talks about speaking evil of no man. And the thought there is defaming somebody or saying something that's wrong. If I said, I don't know, who do I pick on here? Ray stole my car last night, and he actually did. I'm not speaking evil of him. I'm saying the truth. Right? But if he didn't steal my car last night, I have to check. I don't know if I got the key still. Then I would be speaking evil about him. Right? So the Bible warns us about speaking evil. And the point there isn't that we can never say that somebody did something wrong. We just got to make sure it's true. All right, so we are allowed to judge. In fact, we have to. It becomes foolish and shameful when we make this judgment without having the whole story. I have a little comment here about don't be willfully ignorant in this. All right? Sometimes people refuse to see the truth. They want to just, someone did something to them, and no matter what happens, they're going to declare this one thing is the case, and they refuse to see the evidence in front of them. So don't willfully be ignorant and say, I checked into it. No, back up. Don't speak evil of somebody. Make sure there's some truth before you make that judgment. So anyway, the warning is, this does not mean we're not allowed to judge or make some sort of decision. So, second warning is be careful of applying this principle to the exclusion of all other Bible principles. Like I said, there's lots of things in the Bible that are important. This is just one of them. Okay? Imagine a high school class where some kid is glancing at his neighbor's work. All right? The teacher, very rightly, could question about cheating. Right? And you couldn't say, you're judging me without hearing. No. You have failed to avoid the appearance of evil. Plus, you're also violating one of the rules in the handbook, but you have failed to avoid the appearance of evil. You are giving the teacher just cause to think that you're cheating. You don't have the right to go back and say, you're judging me without... No. There are other principles in the Bible that we have to apply. This is just one of them. Or it would be crazy for me to go to the bar. They just stop right there. That's crazy. But if I went to the bar and I ordered a Coke and a hamburger or something and sat there eating something, and one of you came by and said, Mr. Rinehart, what are you doing at the bar? That's wrong. And if I said, I'm drinking a Coke, why would you think I was drinking beer? You'd say, well, because you're in a bar. All right? You're giving the appearance of evil. So there are other principles here. Don't let yourself... We could fall back and say, well, nobody could ever accuse me of anything because there would be judgment without hearing. No. You give forth this appearance of evil, then don't be surprised and let people react to the appearance that you're giving. That's all we can see. We can't get inside of your head. So, all right, so there are other principles. This is not the only one. All right, next warning. As the part of a natural course of life, we make judgment calls and decisions about things that seem obvious, and there's no big deal. All right, so not everything rises to some critical level. Just Saturday, I went to Dollar Tree in town, and there's a lady in front of me with this giant, there's probably 10 or 11 balloons. And I really didn't pay attention to the balloons. I just saw a bunch of balloons. And I said, wow, someone's going to be happy. And she says, well, we're going to the graveyard. And then I looked up, and half the balloons were black. All right, so the lady wasn't mad at me, but I made an assumption. Now, sorry. I was thinking somebody turned 30 or someone turned 40 and they're getting black balloons as a joke. All right, but it was a funeral or something at the graveyard. But it was something relatively innocent. All right. Or at lunch today, you're down there you're eating a salad with no other food. It wouldn't be wrong for someone to come up and say, "Are you on a diet?" Okay, I'm eating a salad, maybe. One of you guys the other day I saw eating a salad, and you said, no, I'm just killing time till the line gets shorter. So, I'm going to get all the food I want. But you would be wrong to say, you're judging me without hearing. You assumed I'm on a diet. So the point is, we could go crazy applying this thing everywhere, and that's not the point. There are assumptions we make based on natural and seemingly obvious things, and there's no point in hammering people about those. So, all right, next warning. Don't judge your teacher or your pastor or whatever authority about how they have applied or made decisions. All right, that's a very, very dangerous place to go. All right, a couple of thoughts about that. One, those people are flawed people just like you. All right, and to expect them to be perfect is dumb. All right, they're flawed people. You being a little gracious would be appropriate. Another thought there, if you're judging and getting mad at the teacher or the pastor, whoever the authority is, you are violating this very principle. You don't know the whole story. We'll get there. You're violating this very principle by getting mad and judging them. So, and then the last point about that one, people that do this type of thing to their pastors or teachers, most of the time, it's because of some other issue. They're proud, or they're bitter, or they're unwilling to forgive, and this is just a way to vent that. They're grasping at straws about something to criticize, and they pick something like this to do it, right? Don't look at this as, now I've got it. I'm going to watch all my teachers and pounce them every time they make. No, that's not the point. That is not the point. You don't know the whole story. So we will revisit that in a minute. But don't use this as an excuse to judge the authority. All right, then right in line with that, focus on applying this to yourself instead of pointing out everyone else's mistakes. All right, we know the classic Bible illustration of the guy with the beam in his eye trying to get the little splinter out of someone else's eye. Get the beam out of your own eye. Don't worry about everyone else. All right, unless you're better than me, you'll spend your entire life trying to get all the beams out of your eyes before you can see clearly to everyone else. Don't focus on applying this to everyone else. Apply it to you. And then the last warning I have here is most of the times I've been involved with this type of situation, the situation is not as bad as I had imagined. Right? There have been some times I heard about something and it just seemed crazy. And I looked into it, and yes, something happened, but it was not nearly what was described to me. It doesn't mean the person that came to me lied. It's just that the person that reported something to me, they didn't know the whole story. They were telling me what they saw. And when I checked into it, it was not nearly as bad. So our thinking naturally is to assume the very worst. And that's a dangerous thing to assume. I once, there was a student who had drawn a picture, and it, at first glance, looked extremely inappropriate. So after it was checked into a little bit, the student was copying something there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. But it looked bad. Right? So once it was checked into, it wasn't nearly what it seemed. I could have called that person in the office and just started yelling at them, and I'd look like an idiot. Right? When it took just a little bit of checking, it wasn't as bad as I thought. Early in my marriage, I was visiting on Saturdays, every Saturday like I still do. And for a couple of weeks, I noticed that it didn't bother me, but I thought, wow, all the laundry's not done. There's certain jobs not getting done at home. My wife's home all day Saturday. I could have thought, I bet she goes to sleep after I leave the house. Probably wakes up just before I get home, like rubbing the sleep out of her. I could have assumed something like that. I really, at that point, I didn't even think about it. But I found out on my birthday that my wife was hemming people's pants and doing some basic tailoring things to make some money to buy me a present. Now, what if I had yelled at her about, what are you doing, woman, wasting your time on Saturday? I would have looked like an idiot. And she might have had a new dress instead of me a birthday present. I don't know. So, all right, so the point is, our mind naturally assumes the worst, or at least mine does. It's easy to go there. And that's not always the case. There have been a few times where I heard about something, I investigated, and it is exactly what it looked like, and it was bad. But that's not the norm, at least from my experience. The norm is there's some other issues there, and once you find out what's really happening, it's not as bad. There still might be a problem, but not nearly as bad as it looked. All right, a couple of warnings. Now let's apply this truth to our lives. We're going to look at several different relationships and think about how we should apply this, or sometimes how it's violated. Try to think of some illustrations as we go through here. So, all right, we can, if we're not careful, apply this in how we think of God. We can look at what God has done in our life and answer the matter before we hear it. In fact, really, we'll never know the whole story till we get to heaven. So at any point along the way, if we start complaining about God, we are answering before we know the end of the story. We haven't heard it yet. We'll never know the whole story till we get to heaven. But there are times where we're tired, or we feel like in our ministries nothing's happening. We go canvassing. Nobody comes to church. All right? And we work hard. And be careful if you're going to start accusing God of things. You don't know the whole story. All right? And with God, we never, ever will. Imagine Joseph in prison. Right? He had been sold into slavery, hated by his brothers, sold into slavery, lied about, thrown in prison. Imagine at that point if he decided to abandon and give up on God. Right when the excitement, right when the miracle is about to happen. Right? If we're not careful, we'll do that same thing. Right? All of us like to think about these great miracles in the Bible, but the great miracle requires a great crisis. Right? And it's at that great crisis that we have to have enough faith to keep trusting God. And if we're not careful, at that point is when we'll violate this principle, and we'll answer the matter before we hear the end of it. So Joseph, imagine Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They stand up for God, literally. I'm not going to bow. And they get condemned to the fiery furnace. And at that point they say, well, forget it. God's abandoned us. I'll worship that silly idol. They would have answered before they heard it. They would have missed out on walking with God in the furnace. Right? That would have been nice. Or Hezekiah complaining about the Syrian army surrounding Jerusalem. The day before, the 185,000 of them are killed. If we're not careful, we'll answer to God and complain about what He's doing, and we're violating this principle. We're answering before we hear the end of it. And with God, really, we'll never know until we get to heaven. So we never have a right to complain. That's part of the reason the Bible says it requires faith to serve God, to please God. One quick example from my life. My dad was a mining engineer, and he was working at this company in West Virginia, and his boss and some others they'd lied, essentially. They'd doctored some paperwork. There had been an accident, and they tried to get my dad to go into court and lie to cover for them. And my dad said no. So he got fired. They actually tried to implicate him in the wrongdoing. Right? I was a ninth grader at this point, so I didn't know what was going on. But him getting fired, him saying, no, I'm going to obey God, we ended up having to move to Virginia. I heard about this place when I got there and came to college from there. And I met my wife here. That's a good thing. Right? My whole life took a completely different direction. In fact, my whole family's life took a completely different direction. And it started with my dad at that dark time saying, you know what? No, I'm going to obey God. It doesn't matter if I lose my job. He's a husband with 3 kids. I'm going to obey God. Left a house that he had custom built for him. We had a beautiful childhood. It was great. Motorcycles and all kinds of stuff. Go walk over the hill and go shooting. We had a lot of fun. But left all that to go live in the suburbs in D.C. They were still shooting, but it wasn't legal. So, all right, but anyway, the point there is if my dad had given up at that dark point and said, well, I've got to feed my family, so I'll do this. No. He would have missed out on that blessing. And if we're not careful, we'll do the same thing to God. So, all right, so we can do this to God if we're not careful. Really, that's a matter of faith. Excuse me, but this verse also fits there. All right, bosses, not bossy people, bosses can also violate this principle with their employees. Right? You might be able to think of a boss, like I mentioned earlier, the boss that thought I was undermining his authority. Bosses have to be very careful to get the complete story. They hear all kinds of things coming at them. They should take some time and investigate. I worked for a concrete company in Virginia. Abby Vance Langhorne, you'll get to meet him, at Heritage. And I was a teenager. My job, I was the low man on the totem pole, was to carry all of the lumber and the forming material onto the truck and stack it and get it tied down and ready to go. So this one day I'm hauling everything up to the front and take one load and set it down there. I hadn't tied it down because there was more coming. Went to get another load and came back and the truck's gone. The boss had come and driven off. Just loose 2x4s laying all over the place. It's not ready. And the boss came back and he started to get angry. But as soon as I explained what happened, he said, no, you're okay. You're right. I drove off without asking. He could have just kept pounding me, but he realized he had made the mistake, not me. And if we're not careful, bosses, not we, when you get to be a boss at some point, you got to be careful to get the whole story. It's easy to get half of it. I had, this has been years ago, both ladies involved are pastors' wives and doing great, so don't think these people are evil. But I had one teacher come to me and say that another teacher was undermining their authority. The one teacher was going to other parents and talking about this other teacher. And I'm going, oh my, that's terrible. What's going on? And supposedly we're all Christians. So I looked into it, and the one teacher thought she was helping. There's a new teacher that had come in, and the experienced teacher said, you know what, I'm going to field some of these questions so the new teacher can focus on teaching. Now, that was a problem. All right, the experienced teacher should really let the new teacher handle that because she should have realized. But she wasn't going about in life thinking, I'm going to ruin this other teacher's day. Right? And that's the way it's presented to me. I thought, my goodness, I'm going to have to get rid of a teacher in the middle of school year? What is going on? And it wasn't nearly like that. Right? Still, there was a problem, but it was not nearly like it was explained to me. So bosses have to be careful. Right? Employees have to be careful towards their boss. Again, none of you would have ever done this, but you might have overheard conversations about how the boss doesn't know what he's doing. The boss doesn't know how to organize things. The boss wastes money. You've ever heard conversations like that? All right. I know you weren't involved, but you might have heard them. All right. The truth is, the employees don't know the whole story. And that's the end of it. You don't know the whole story. You don't know what other factors the boss has to weigh. And to you, it may seem like a waste of time. But to the boss who's spending his own money, it's not. And you be very careful about answering that matter before you hear it. Along the same line with employees to bosses, we need to be very careful about going to our boss with a half story. I also thought about children to parents just now, going to your parents with a half story. Right? You could set up your boss or your parents with half a story. If you're going to go and tell them about some problem, you owe it to them to do a little bit of checking to make sure it's what it sounds like. Don't go set them up. Don't throw this problem on them and make them do all the work. Be a good employee. Check into it. Don't assume the worst. And I saw Colt smiling over there. I'm sure he would never tell his parents half a story about a situation in school. Never. We're Christians. All right, it happens. But don't do that. You're setting them up to make this mistake. All right, teachers towards students. Teachers can make this mistake towards students. Teachers have to be careful not to make false accusations. Okay? That doesn't mean every time a false accusation is made that they're violating this principle. But teachers need to be careful, do a little bit of due diligence. So if a student gets caught for talking, the teacher has to give them the merits. They don't have a choice. The teacher doesn't typically have to go on and speculate. I bet you were planning to rob the snack shop and just make this giant story. No, you got demerits for talking. Leave it right there. A child turn around in his seat should get demerits for that. Okay? If they're in the middle of a test and the kid's copying answers, there'll be another issue of cheating to deal with. But you have to deal with what's there. We don't have to, as has happened at times. Some kid gets caught for lying. In fact, I was joking with the elementary kids in line last week. I pretended that someone told me a lie, and they said, I bet you also were disrespectful as you lied. So that's 5 more demerits. And we stacked up about 40 demerits that they earned right there on the spot. And the kids go, we were joking. But teachers can pile on to kids and start assuming all of these evil motivations, which sometimes is true, but not always, right? And that's a dangerous thing. I'm thinking of you teachers here someday. You don't want to hurt the student by assuming those evil intentions. Now, if there's something wrong, you have to address it. Right? The second one here with teachers is we don't want to make false accusations. And then also, secondly, we can't ignore disobedience just because we thought the kid meant well. Well, I know they were talking, but they were talking without permission. On both sides of this, we can judge the action. We have to be careful not to make a mistake. All right, so teachers towards students. Before I leave that, I'm sorry, one little note here. Bosses, teachers, and even pastors, there's a lot of responsibility on our shoulders. We have to make these judgment calls. We have to make decisions. And we need some wisdom and discretion from God to be wise as we handle that. The questions come up. It's going to be there. And if you're ever a pastor or a teacher or the boss, you need some wisdom from God to do well. And those that are underneath authority, you need to be very, very careful about criticizing. You don't know the whole story. You don't know. If you really are frustrated, say, man, they keep making the wrong decisions about me, then don't put them in that position. If you don't want the teacher to wonder if you're cheating, crazy idea. Don't act like it. Don't force them to make that judgment call. I've had students, I'm not thinking about anybody here in particular, I've had students that seem to enjoy seeing how close they could look like they were doing something wrong and then reacting like, oh, I wasn't doing that. You did everything but do it. You were looking like it. Don't put them in that position. All right? There's some hard calls that have to be made. And students, if you don't want the call to be made wrong, then don't force them to have to do that. All right. So that's teachers towards their students. Students towards the teacher. Right? Students also should be careful not to imagine that the teacher doesn't like them and is picking on them. Okay? I joke sometimes with my classes that this is because I don't like you. Here's some homework. Right? But teachers have to be careful, or students have to be careful. It's in our mind. The teacher hates me. The teacher doesn't like me. The teacher gives me an embarrassment and nobody else. That's a dangerous place to go. Right? We should not assume those motivations. The teacher knows a lot more than you. And I'm not just talking about academics. They know the whole situation. They might know what's gone on in other classes and other things that bears on how they handle a certain situation. And it's wrong for the students to act like, I know what's going on here and the teacher was wrong. Very, very dangerous place to go. Very dangerous. All right, so students can violate this principle in dealing with their teachers or with the principal himself. So, all right, the pastor towards church members. Right? The pastor deals with very complicated and difficult problems in people's lives. Right? It's part of the job. Very complicated jobs. He needs to be sure to get the whole picture, and then he needs to speak the truth in love. Right? The pastor can't ignore something. He does owe it to his church members to find out what really happened, and then he has to address it. All right, you guys that are trained to be a pastor, you'll have great power to hurt or to help. And I know you want to help, but if you're not careful, you can hurt somebody greatly by not digging in and finding out the whole story. Right? The pastor will need to correct people. It's going to come up. You want to make sure that if somebody gets mad and gets angry and leaves or something like that, then it's because they disagree with God's word. Right? You don't want them to, don't give them the excuse. They shouldn't take it, but you don't want to give them the excuse of how you misread and misjudged the situation. It's a very difficult job and it requires some discretion. It's part of the reason why I should pray for our pastor, because he needs great wisdom and discretion. All right, church members towards their pastors. We can violate this thing. All right, so this is similar to the teacher, but the pastor is given to us by God. So another level of authority here that we've got to be very careful with if we're going to complain about our pastor, because we don't know the whole story with him. So church members almost never know the whole story. All right, the pastor will make some decision, a school decision, someone gets in trouble or something like that, and almost always people don't know the whole story. And it has to be that way. Unless you want your pastor to be the chief gossip in the whole county. It has to be that way. Think of the last time you got in serious trouble. And imagine Pastor Mitchell getting up on Thursday night and saying, all right, just so everybody knows why this person got in trouble, here's what they did. How many would be happy with that? No, the pastor can't do that. It'd be inappropriate. It'd be wrong. But sometimes church members get upset and say, I think the pastor misunderstood there. I think the pastor was too harsh. No, you don't know. You are answering the matter before you heard it. You've got to be very, very careful. We don't know, and we can't know if things are appropriate. Pastor Mitchell does things that I'm not aware of. I don't know the whole story. It'd be wrong for me to storm into his office and say, I think you made a mistake. Most likely he would turn around to me and say, no, you made the mistake. This is what really happened. We have to be very, very careful there. We have to trust our pastor, or at the very least trust the God that gave us our pastor, that he'll give him wisdom. Right? It's easy to fall into this trap. And this is a good place where people that want to point at their pastor and make this type of accusation, there's some bitterness, there's some unforgiveness, there's something else going on festering, and this is just the outlet for it. But nonetheless, it's a mistake that we can make. All right, last application here is friend to friend. All right, if you're not careful, you will ruin friendships by violating this principle. You will assume somebody did something for some reason, and then the fissure started, and eventually you're not talking anymore. I've seen close friends ripped apart over time because of violating this principle. Right? Don't assume. Go and talk to them. That's safer. Don't assume. You will ruin close friends. Proverbs 17, a friend loveth at all times. Right? We're never assuming bad. If there's wrong, we've got to address it. A man that hath friends must show himself friendly. You act grouchy and mean, then don't be surprised. We don't have friends. But we can violate this principle with their friends and lose close friends if we're not careful. All right, the verse was, he that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is folly and shame to him. Let me wrap this up with just 3 concluding thoughts here. First one, don't bring folly and shame into your life by answering a matter before you hear it. Don't do that. Evil surmisings, speaking evil, those cause great harm and damage to others, and it brings folly and shame unto us. Second, don't be afraid to speak the truth in love when you do know what is happening. We have to. You find out the whole story and there's an issue that has to be dealt with, you've got to. Speak the truth in love. It doesn't, this principle doesn't mean we ignore everything. It means we find out what's happening and then you deal with it appropriately. And then the last one, don't use this as an excuse to disregard those in authority. God put Pastor Mitchell and others here as our authority. We're not perfect, but don't use this as an excuse. If you find yourself going down this road all the time, making these types of accusations in your mind at least, most likely there's some bitterness or something else going on that causes you to go down that road. Dig it out and get it wrong, because the verse does say it brings folly and shame to the person that violates this principle. So, let's pray. Lord, we ask that you would help us as we think about this simple thought from your word about answering before we hear something. Lord, help us not to do that. Our flesh likes to. It jumps that route. But Lord, help us to be cautious and a little bit deliberate and have some discretion and not make this mistake. Lord, think especially of those who are training to be in the ministry, to be pastors or teachers. Lord, help them to get a hold of this simple idea. And Lord, use this to give them wisdom as they pastor and teach those that they work with. Lord, be at the invitation time. Help those who need to respond to come and deal with you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.